one of the reasons I became a photographer, but more than that, I think my education initially, that kind of first drop of inspiration around activism, happened through images. In 1988, I went back east to go to my sister's wedding. And when I was back there, I was in New York City first. I flew into New York and was visiting a couple of friends. And I heard about this kind of somewhat newly formed group called ACT UP. They'd been around for maybe a year, was like just like taking the world by storm. So I went to a meeting, and then the next thing I knew, I was at a protest called the Bedsheet Action, which was a die-in the street. I think it might have been on Fifth Avenue. Just this amazing action with hundreds of people with so much passion. And I was aware of AIDS, and I knew that this group called ACT UP was happening. But I think that was right before we started Seattle ACT UP. So that was kind of my introduction into starting to document activism around AIDS. So 1990 was the 6th International Conference on AIDS in San Francisco. And the ACT UP Seattle group, which at that point then had grown a lot. Like we started with like 6 people in a room. And then I remember we realized we have to get a bigger meeting room because there were like 100 people. But when we had formed a couple of different groups, but a bunch of us went down to the 6th International Conference on AIDS. And so that picture of Allison Hunter, she's in her wheelchair, so she's lower down in the front, that one that I was pointing out with Fern and Kristen and Brian and Michael, and a whole bunch of us went down. ACT UP groups from all over the country, all over the world, converged on San Francisco. There was so much that happened, because when you talk about healthcare as a basic human right, of course, racial injustice and homophobia and all the other, and all the other issues are woven together, and ACT UP was able to really do that. Looking at how people of color are disproportionately impacted by the AIDS crisis, how women were not being even counted as even getting AIDS, and therefore not worthy to study or be part of clinical trials. All of these issues were brought together, and so it brought a lot of different people together. And we just took over San Francisco and the conference, actually. We busted into the conference at one point and just shut it down. And Louis Sullivan couldn't even speak at one point. We had air horns going off. But there was also, that was, where we were having these amazing workshops at night in these warehouse spaces. Different committees from different ACT UP groups all over the country were doing teach-ins. There was a treatment agenda, this document that was presented to some of the researchers at the conference. It became like the most talked about document at the conference. I got arrested there. Lots of people got arrested. And again, it was like this, you're just part of this movement, and there's so much momentum and education going on, not just to try to educate others, but to try to educate ourselves. Later that year, I was back east again. I was back east with my grandfather. I was with him for his death. And after he died, I heard about there's an action in Atlanta at the CDC, and the focus of it was going to be women and AIDS. I just remember it was just pouring rain that day, and it was World AIDS Day. And again, to me, that the image of the woman, both of those images, the person who's not doing anything has this silence equals death and veil, and it's almost just this metaphor of like this ghost, and then this other person who's just like screaming at the top of her lungs in the pouring rain, and it says women don't get AIDS, they just die from it. Amazing to be there and have everybody focusing on women and AIDS, this idea that it's not, it's not about one group, that we are all fighting for each other. This is at Pike Place Market. That's during an anti-war protest. That's probably January of 91. And so, yeah, like bringing together all these issues of like allocation of resources and prioritizing things like low income housing, and seeing how the AIDS epidemic is obviously going to, just as we know any epidemic or pandemic really amplifies all of the inequities that there are, or those inequities get just brought into so much more light when something like a war is going on. I have all these images of Reverend Jeffries from all different protests that I was participating in and photographing. And then, of course, there he is again, making those connections between racial injustices and fighting for racial equity and the AIDS epidemic and AIDS activism. And so it's just to the point of the intersection between issues, and his kind of biggest cause as an activist, I would say, throughout time was like how do we practically approach economic inequities in our communities. In 1991, ACT UP Youth Caucus formed, and I was involved with that. I was like the old person that I think it was because I had all these photographs and I could help them with their graphics and whatever. I don't know why, but they were not much, but they were younger than I was. Anyway, we did a How to Fuck Safely pamphlet and distributed them as kids were getting off buses at different high schools, and got chased out of there so fast because they were very graphic. I had done the photographs for them, and we did these really graphic, like, this is how you use a dental dam, this is how you use a rubber, and showing like images and trying to like make it kind of like it's sexy, to care about the people you're having sex with, and really being very graphic, and the kids were just like grabbing the pamphlets. They loved it. And the thing that happened out of that, which leads to this image, is, then there's this election coming the next year. And in September, there was a Bush rally out in Colville, Washington, like serious, kind of not necessarily sympathetic to the causes of AIDS, the people that were going to be at this rally. And the Youth Caucus was like, we got to be there. We got to go and educate people about AIDS, because these are folks that are supporting Bush, and they probably don't have the information. And we engaged in lots of conversations with these Bush supporters, and their whole rally outside of where he was speaking, their whole rally just took on this other focus. Suddenly there was this whole other thing happening, and it was not just talking about AIDS, but talking about homophobia and safe sex, and with these like logger dudes, really. So the way that these young people who were in their teens and early 20s, most of them in the Seattle ACT UP Youth Caucus, they realized like, oh, we've got to get into like electoral politics matters. And then 1993 was the March on Washington in Washington, D.C. That was at the Holocaust Museum. And again, so here we are, like a million queer people and their allies come together for the largest march ever at up to that point on Washington, D.C., calling for all kinds of, just basic human rights for queer identified people. Silence equals death. That's ACT UP's, main kind of like, from the very beginning, it was the phrase, I think, that, on all the t-shirts, taken from what happened at the Holocaust, during the Holocaust in Europe, and then relating that to a contemporary issue. That's a Seattle protest. And that was all around, like, the idea that ACT UP affinity groups were putting out this idea of like a Manhattan Project approach to finding a cure for AIDS, or, you know, eventually what would be the cocktail. And we made that was the thing about ACT UP that for me I loved so much, was that there were just so many artists in the movement at allocating time and dedicating resources to making these great graphic designs and signs. And I love that. Yeah, that's one of the ones that we made in Seattle, and it has like a clock and the time bomb that was ticking. For me, so many times at these protests, there were people there who clearly were dying, and a lot of times people were in wheelchairs or having to just sit down for most of the protests. Their energy level was obviously not as high as others, but there was so much, again, just support. I think, you know, I can only imagine, but having had some of my very close friends at protests right up until the very end, like Michael Davidson and Allie and Brian and Max, knowing that you're probably not going to see it out to the, you know, to a point where there's something more available that's going to help people living with AIDS not die right away. What a lot of these protests meant to people who were dying of AIDS, that they were showing up at those protests all the time. It wasn't like a big deal. Look at me. Like, it was like, I'm here and I'm making a difference. That image is powerful for me in that way, of just knowing that so many people were just protesting right up until they just physically couldn't be out there anymore. We were in this fight together, in this struggle together, and like a bunch of us didn't make it through, you know, a bunch of us aren't still alive, you know, we're here, I believe, but it's what made ACT UP for me kind of akin to what I saw with the Committee of Mothers of the Disappeared in El Salvador. It's our comrades, right, that we're linked arms with, and we probably aren't all, you know, we knowing like some of us are already gone, and not all of us are going to, you know, get to the other side of this together, but we're in it together. And so that's kind of what comes up for me when I see those images.